Good evening. I'm Apostle T.B. Walker. I want to take this time to welcome you to our Thursday Night Live Bible study. Certainly glad to have you here. We are nearly at the end of the saga of the children of Israel being in bondage to Egypt. And I want to read to you out of the book of Exodus today, chapter number 12. And I'm just going to read 6 verses. This is 1 through 6, actually 7 verses. But I'm going to read this in your hearing. And you'll see here that the children of Israel don't just leave. They're going to be thrust out. And the prophecy is that they're going to be commanded to leave. But there's a certain amount of pomp and circumstance and drama that we see around this moment. And why not? They've been in bondage for 400 years. So it's fitting that they don't just march out the gates. But there's some things that have to happen that are filled with meaning and symbolism for things that are to come. Let's take a look again at the scripture. It says, "Now the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, this month shall be your beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year for you. Speak to all the congregation of Israel, saying, on the 10th day of this month, every man should take himself a lamb, according to the house of his father, a lamb for a household. And if the household is too small for the lamb, let him and his neighbor then next to his house take it according to the number of the persons, according to each man's need. You shall make your count for the lamb, and your lamb shall be without blemish, a male of the first year. You may take from it from a sheep or from the goat. Now you shall keep it until the 14th day of the same month. Then the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it at twilight." Now, let's take a look at this, because this is really, once again, really, really interesting. The moment is clearly different. This is not like any of the other plagues. There's no preparation for hearing what Pharaoh's going to say. Nobody's going in and God is giving some additional instructions. No, this is preparation for the end. This is moving time. Now it is only now hearing what God has already spoken. We're no longer listening to what Pharaoh is going to say. The difference is in this plague, this comes with some very explicit instructions on how they are to commemorate their deliverance, and that's given to them directly by God. And it consisted of celebrating the Passover of the Lord. We know, and God has instructed Moses that the angel of death, which is going to go through all of Israel, well, all of Egypt rather, and is going to kill the firstborn of all of those that are in Egypt and all of those who don't have this blood on the doorpost. There is going to be, because the angel of death is going to pass over those who have the blood on the doorpost, then there's going to be a need here to celebrate. There's a celebration of God passing over those homes, that the angel of death, as you can see, moving from house to house, but conditionally and intentionally avoiding certain homes, looking at the condition that is met. They have the blood. Right. So he goes over each and every house. But those that don't have the house of the blood on their doorstep, there's going to be great wailing. They're going to awaken either then or maybe later in the morning. But somehow they're going to awaken to a great tragedy, because this is not something that a person that you can resuscitate. This is not a person who's going to be in need of healing. This is going to be the death of a child. And that child may be an infant, or that child could be 40. This may be an only child, but the firstborn is going to die. And it's the blood that makes a difference. That's really the key that God wants to get over to Moses. It is the blood that makes a difference. When it's smeared on the doorpost and on the lintels, the inside of the doorway, this is the key. And listen, why do we have these? What's the point of having these? Well, there's a finality here that comes in this 10th plague. And this is really a pivotal moment that we don't want to miss, because it is the climax here of God's judgment on Egypt. And it is also the release of Israel from slavery. At the very same time that judgment is ended, the release also coincides with God finally and climaxing his judgment. This plague is not just another affliction, but it's a direct challenge and a period behind the question of, who are you that I should release the children of these slaves, right? Who are you that I should obey you? This is the climax of that answer. And it shows the gravity of this situation. But there's also something else that God is doing in dealing with the blood, and also dealing with this new covenant that he's establishing with the children of Israel. He's making a difference. There's a difference between these people. Earlier when you see the plagues, one of the things that you'll see is that both groups suffer. When you look at these plagues, you kind of think that everything's inflicted upon Egypt, but both of the groups suffer. But now there's a need to make a clear line of demarcation, right? This is the line that cannot be crossed. This is the line that's going to fulfill the promise, as God makes a plumb line, as he draws a line in the sand. Those that are on this side are going to deal with judgment. Those that are on this other side are going to receive the promises that God has given. And it's not because of their goodness or their greatness. It's because of the blood. And that symbolizes something that later we'll see in the New Testament, that we also have a lamb and we also are saved by the blood of the lamb, right? So when you begin to look at this blood symbolizes a couple things. It symbolizes the obedience and the faithfulness to God's command in establishing a covenant relationship. Listen, we know what the blood is going to do from the heavenly standpoint, but also for them to now go and have to trust and believe God about this angel of death. They would have been terrified themselves, but to find out that there's some instructions that may seem strange. There's some instructions that may seem, impossible. How in the world would lamb's blood stop the angel of death? How in the world can blood? But they were not to question it. They were to move in this radical area of faith before they left. Listen, this was not a trial. This was the doorway to their release. This was not a test, but this was absolutely the hallway that God had created for them to walk out of bondage into freedom. It is the blood. And it is an open door that's open to anybody who's willing to believe. So the Lord now speaks to Moses. He says, listen, the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, this month shall be your beginning of months, and it shall be the first month for you. Now, they didn't just leave Israel during the Passover. No, because that's when the angel of death was passing over. But they left after that, the next day, which would have been the feast of the unleavened bread, right? So they leave this next day. But now when you look at this feast of the unleavened bread being the next day, the Lord says this month shall be your beginning of months. So this happens on the 14th. Then the next day, the 15th, is the Feast of the Unleavened Bread. We will talk a little bit later about them having to eat quickly and not having time for even the bread to rise. They were going to carry it, in their handkerchiefs. So, but that's the next day, because now there's a pronouncement that has to happen before they leave. The killing of the firstborn has to happen. And I say it like that because I want it to sound as brutal as it may appear. But their coming deliverance was significant. It was a significant act that God told his children of Israel to remake your calendar. This was so powerful that he says, it's going to change your whole life. It's going to change where you are in time, that you're not even going to walk in the same calendric year that you walked in Egypt. Now, it doesn't mean that there is not a calendar that you see here that the world has, right? And that that the Israel was aware of, right? Monday still stays Monday, Tuesday still Tuesday, right? I'm just using that. But the reality is that God says, this is the beginning. Your deliverance is the beginning of your new calendar year. Your deliverance is the beginning of your new life. That when you begin to track your life and your birth and your beginning, this is something he says, this is the beginning of who you really are. That's who you were. The calendars that you were living under, the times and the dates that you were living under, those were the constraints that you had. Those were the times where you were not yourself. You were not your full self. But now you're living in a new calendar year. There's new time. This year is now going to be the start of your redemption. Your redemption marks your new life. And that's really amazing when you begin to see what God is doing there in the very same way that he does it with us now. This was a dramatic way of God saying everything is about to change. There's nothing here that's going to be the same. When you leave this place, this is really interesting and scary all at the same time, because they've never known another life, and no different than being saved. It's interesting and scary and wonderful all at the same time, because what's it like not to be bound to Satan? What's it like not to live in darkness? What is it like? People have all manner of trepidation about salvation because this is all I know. And God says, that is a new calendar year for you. Your life's about to start anew. You are being born again. These children of Israel are being born again. This is the ultimate. You see the ultimate statement that Jesus says, behold, I make all things new. He's making all things new. As he says, speak to the congregation of Israel. Now, again, that may seem like nothing, but this is the first time that you see in these 5 books of the law. This is the first time you see God begin to talk about Israel in this way as a congregation. We get the word ecclesia in the New Testament, meaning the church or the assembly, where he begins to say this very same thing here. Speak to the assembly, speak to the congregation, speak to the grouping that's been ordained. That sounds like the ecclesia, or in other words, that is the church. This is an important step because God is now establishing Israel as a nation. They are just a group of people that have come together that have certain connections, but have lost some connections over time. But this is different. This is something dramatically different. This now is a group of people who are walking and living together, uniting under one banner. They're being united by God. So you look at this, he says, on the 10th day of this month, every man shall take for himself a lamb, right? According to the house of his father, a lamb for a household. And if the household is too small for the lamb, let him and his neighbor next to his house take it according to the number of persons, however many people are in his house. According to each man's needs, you shall make your count for the lamb. So now this is on that 10th day of the month, right? Families would get together and they would have this lamb feast, this Passover lamb. And even in this situation, they would eat the Passover lamb. But the key that I want you to see here is that this was not a national celebration as we know it now. It certainly would later become that, but this is about family. When you begin to look at the first Passover was a meal that was meant to be eaten by the family. And eaten by the family and those that were close to you, those that were around, right? This was an experience that was meant to be had together. It was wholly domestic. It was a family festival. And that's the origin of the Passover. When you begin to see the church and you see these connections, the origin of the church is that this is about the family, that the worship is about the family. The head of the house is this priest who's meant to teach his family, even at home. So when you begin to look at this, the Bible connects the family even with the church. How can the person be a leader and a ruler over the church? How can he possibly care for the body of Christ and care for the church if he does not rule his own house well? You see here, the family's not kicked to the side. The family's not relegated to something that's underneath the assembly. No, the beginning of the Passover feast is had in the house. That they were supposed to share it with those that are around them. The gospel is meant to be had in the house and it's meant to be shared with those that are around. There's meant to be an overflow. When you look at this, he says, listen, if you have a whole lamb here, if the family's too small, there's going to be more than enough for you to be able to share it with your neighbors who are next to you, because I don't want there to be any lamb left. I want the whole lamb to be eaten. Listen, when you look at this, it's interesting because there's no temple. There's no tent of meeting. There's no place here to meet God. There's no altar. There's no priest. You meet God right there in your house. You see him right there in the house. The young, the old, everyone together, feasting in celebration of what God is doing. That's the origin of the ecclesia. That's the origin of the church. And you begin to see the origin. We've kind of gotten away where it is a distant place, where the greatest places of revelation are going to be in the church, that the greatest places of order and knowledge that we get are going to be in the church. And listen, if your wife's got questions, the best thing for her to do is to ask the pastor, or to go to a women's, conference, or to go somewhere to find out, as opposed to in the house. But you see, the origin was not that. The origin, even in the New Testament, the Lord says, listen, if your wife has questions, let her ask her husband at home. That means he's supposed to know. So there's some things that we have gotten away from that you begin to see that was not that way in the beginning. That was not the way that it was in the beginning. You begin to see those very same things happening again in the New Testament. Lord, what about the divorce? He says, Jesus says, hey, Moses gave you a bill of divorcement because of the hardness of your heart. But then he says, and you can kind of hear the tone where he says, but it was not that way in the beginning. So, when you look at this, he says, and I want you to see this because this is really so great. He says, I want you to take a lamb and I want you to gauge whether you're going to share this or not, or whether you need to share it according to each man's needs, right? According to how much he can eat, which is what is being said there. Now, I want you to see this. God is now preparing them bountifully. He's preparing them in abundance. I would imagine like all you can eat is not something that they've heard in a long time. But God is now beginning to shower favor down upon them. He's beginning to shower change as he's made a difference. There's going to be a dearth and a cry in the land. The scripture says that has not been heard before or will be since. Well, I can promise you the very same thing here, that you've got the exact same situation where you're going to see the exact same things that are happening, where there's going to be a dearth that's in a abundance in the land. There's going to be a feast where there's a famine on one side. There's going to be a feast. People are going to be offering them things. They're going to be giving them all manner of things. So when you begin to see this, you begin to see that God is simply saying, whatever you can eat, if you can eat it all, then I want you to have it all. If not, I want you to have so much that you're able to give to your neighbor. And so that depends on how the size of your household. And since a small size household couldn't eat the whole lamb, they were instructed here by God to celebrate the Passover with their neighbors, right? This isn't just like give them some food. No, eat with them. They were supposed to celebrate with them. They were supposed to come together. That's this fellowship that we have tried our best to gain with our own ideas. And we've missed the idea that God says, listen, it's going to really start at home. Listen, if you are not fellowshipping with your neighbors, if you don't know your neighbors, you got people that are believers and that are right across the street and down the street from you, that there's no connection. We know it. We see them in the morning. We wave, we see them on Sunday. We see them with church clothes on, so we wave at them, but we don't have a connection. This was God before there's a temple, before there's a priest, before there's any kind of rules and regulations, before there's even the law that's being given. God is showing the love that's supposed to precede everything. Because when that love precedes everything, then you can actually begin to operate without any pressure to love. The law was really about the pressure that was there to care. And Jesus starts out with this Passover. The Lord gives us here, I want you to care for each other naturally. I want it to be something that is spiritually put in you because you share the same situation. You come out of the same darkness together. You're in the same actual light, and you have been passed over by the same angel of death, right? The same death that destroys everybody did not destroy you. The same death that consumes everybody and that causes everybody to wail, not you. There's a difference being made. And the connection may not be that, you come from the same place, that you both are from the South, that you both are from the East Coast, that you both have the same, choir experience. There may be none of those things, maybe very different ethnic groups. But because you have had the same angel of death that's passed over you, because of the same grace and mercy of God, who told the angel, you cannot touch those that have the blood. The angel of death is not the one who makes the call. The angel of death, if he had his way, would kill everybody. That's why it's called the angel of death. That's what he does. That's his job, right? That's his MO. So he doesn't know how to spare unless God would make him spare, unless God would force him to spare. He cannot spare. So when you begin to look at this, one of the things that it should make us and give us pause to really understand is the mercy of God and the grace of God, and where our connections and fellowship are supposed to be. Our connections and fellowship are supposed to be in the fact that we serve the same God who has blessed us in the same way, who's given us the same new life and has ushered us into the same new reality. That's supposed to be our connector. And when our connections are other things, when they're political, when our connections are racial, when our connections are anything else other than the grace and the mercy of God, you're going to have backbiting. You're going to have problems. You're going to have inroads. You're going to have favoritism. You're going to have people who are going to say, I'm of Paul. I'm of Cephas. Right? I'm of Apollos. You're going to have those very same people who will forget that the distinction is not in your denomination. The distinction is not in your church. The distinction is that God, because of the blood, has made a difference in you and the world. That's our distinction. And he says, but when you go get this lamb, I want you to make sure that this lamb shall be without blemish and shall be a male of the first year. The sacrifice has to be the best you have, right? He says, listen, I want you to go out and get a lamb, but I don't want you to get any lamb. I want you to look through the lambs and pick the one that has no spot or blemish. If you got a great one, but he's got a little small spot, listen, I want you to let him go. This is the sacrifice. This is the only sacrifice you have to make. And guess what? You have a lamb to do it. You've got a place to go get it. I provided the sacrifice already. You just have to go find it, right? Seek and you shall find. This is a picture of what is to come. You know, New Testament believers have been delivered in the exact same way by the blood of an unblemished lamb. This is foretelling. This is really, really, really the revelation of something to come. This is the foreshadowing of Christ coming. And he says, listen, you can take the lamb from among the sheep or from the goats. You know, if you don't, it doesn't really matter here. Now, you know, I mean, as we look at this, we are accustomed to hearing about the lamb. That's what John said. Behold the lamb that takes away the sins of the world, right? But here he says you can either use a sheep or a goat. It doesn't really matter. Now, you know, the lamb has significance, which we understand. Right, we see the meekness and the lowliness of the lamb, but the goat has some significance too that will later be seen in the Old Testament as well as the Pentateuch begins to be written down. You'll begin to see that there's a scapegoat, right? There's a goat that they would take and they would put their hands on the head of the goat, and those would come and they would whisper into the ears of the goat, and they would whisper their sins, and the goat would then be ushered outside of the camp, symbolizing him taking their sins with him. This is symbolic here. This lamb that is pure and without blemish, that is led dumb before the slaughter, doesn't say a mumbling word, is a symbol we understand. But man, what about the goat? What about the idea that this is also the scapegoat? He does nothing wrong. He's going to be exiled. Listen, you take a goat and you send that goat outside the city to wander on his own, he's meat. He's going to die. This is literally a death sentence. Does that remind you of anything? A lamb who was slain before the foundation of the world, who takes away the sins of the world. So when you begin to look at this goat has special significance too. Now, you know, obviously in their wanderings, God allowed them to use the sheep or the goat. But it seems like it appears that only a lamb was used later as time goes on. You know, we begin to see as God begins to use and open the door for symbolism, then it begins to settle on some things for us. And, you know, it doesn't matter about the lamb or the goat. You know, what really mattered here is obedience by the people in these differing situations, eating in the right way that God said to eat, cleaning up in the right way that God said to eat, picking the lamb correctly in the way that God said that it's supposed to happen. Obedience was the key. Listen, it starts here with obedience. And this was a problem that Israel would struggle with throughout its whole history, obedience. This was a major problem, and this problem has to be corrected and will not be corrected until the millennial reign of Christ. That they will always struggle with this understanding of being obedient, no matter how much the deliverance, no matter how deep that you begin to see here, no matter how deep the heart of God is revealed, they struggle doing what he says. Man, it sounds like the church. Very same thing. Obedience. Sacrifice is pretty easy. That's why God says obedience is better than sacrifice. So he says about this lamb, he says, now you should keep it until the 14th day of the same month. Now, so they take this lamb and they have this lamb basically 4 days. They get on the 10th day of the first month, right? And then the lamb lives with the family for 4 days until the Passover. So you can imagine that this lamb is taken care of. This lamb is actually loved. This lamb is actually protected for 4 days. In some ways, as you look at this lamb becomes a part of the family. You can see the kids, with the lamb, and the lamb is cute. And, this is a lamb that is special. They're farm animals. And then there's one that you're taking into your house, to actually succor and to actually give, food and shelter and clothing and even affection for 4 days. This special lamb is in your presence. And then all of a sudden, you're asked now to kill this lamb. But by the time that you've been asked to kill this lamb is now cherished. And the death of this lamb means something. This lamb will be mourned. This will not just be easy. And this is amazing as God uses this same practice here. Keep this lamb for 4 days with you. It's like, you may not like a dog. You say, I don't like a dog. But if you had a dog in the house and somebody, one of your children or somebody was house sitting, or was bringing the dog over time, and just in a short time, especially you had a really nice dog and a cute dog, before you know it, you like that dog. You care about that dog. That the pain of that dog means something to you. That dog's hunger means something to you. You begin to love the dog, and now you got to give him away. Well, here they've got to kill him. And this is, again, a connection that God says, I want you to sacrifice something that's precious to you. I want you to feel this. This is not something that is just going to just happen. I want you to connect to this moment. And the only way we can connect to the moment is to be invested in the moment. And God had to have them invested, not just with money or with things, but with your heart. They had to invest their heart. God, this is hard now to do. I've learned to love little Fluffy here. He wakes up with us every morning. The way he makes this sound when he walks, I actually like that. And now I've got to take the knife to him. This is filled with symbolism of the killing of Christ by people. This is filled with symbolism about the innocence of this lamb being slain for them, for their sustenance, for their life. They have life as a result of this lamb, killed for them, so that the lamb's blood has the power to protect them. That the angel of death that wins every single battle here on earth, that really has nobody's ever defeated them, it is the blood of this lamb that makes the angel of death hold and go no further. That's amazing. That's a sacrifice. And that's what he wanted them to connect to. And then he says, listen, on the whole congregation shall come together and shall kill it at midnight. When you look at this, and this is pretty easy. We don't have to break down what's going to happen. The lamb's going to die. But, we look at this and we have communion and we look at the pictures of the Lord's Supper and we commemorate, the Lord's Supper. This is my blood, that was shed for you. Drink this and do this in remembrance of me, right? As often as you do this, you'll do this, in remembrance of me, right? You'll be commemorating my death, right? So when you look at this, we understand that symbolism, but we can forget that on the Lord's Supper was Jesus actually celebrating the Feast of Passover. We forget that lamb that was being talked about, that they were eating, was the last symbol. That lamb, the symbolism of that lamb ended. For many, many, many years, they killed a lamb. And what I described to you was happening in households all throughout Israel. And wherever there was a dispersion of the Israelites, it was that, and where they kept the covenant and the feast of the Passover, the same act was happening. This precious lamb was being slain. But it's at this moment at the Lord's Supper that the lamb that was slain before the foundation of the world, the one who John says, behold, the lamb who takes away the sins of the earth, all men. Do you see here that the lamb is sitting at the table, having this last Passover, and then is preparing himself to go out and be crucified? Jesus celebrates the Passover and then becomes the lamb. This is why this moment It's not something we just gloss over. Listen, I know that there's some things that are just, those are bigger things, more exciting things that you see. Let's get down to the Passover. Let's get down to the opening of the Red Sea. But we got to see the preparation here, that where God is preparing his people for miracles. God's preparing his people for these great, great escapades that they're going to do. And it comes with it being us being invested in our hearts. Listen, so many people are missing what God really wants for them, what they can really have in the Lord, because we're not investing in our hearts. We're investing intellectually. We're invested because we know it's a good thing to do. We're invested because we know we're called. But what we may be missing is the sacrifice. That is the heart sacrifice that's required to really, really understand, not just to do. God says, I will give you both the will and to do it by good pleasure. But he says also, in all you're getting, get understanding. Jesus wanted these people to understand what was actually happening in their life. He wanted them to understand what he was doing in their lives. And it's important that we grasp that, what he's doing in our lives. Listen, we're at the end of our Bible study here. I don't want to hold you too long, but I want you to really grasp that. My prayer is that this is a blessing to you. And listen, we're going to be here again next Thursday. We're going to continue on until the children of Israel are across the Red Sea. And the Pharaoh that they've just feared and dealt with for this long period of time, that they will deal with him no more. As you will see that they get to see Pharaoh in their life drown, you are going to experience exactly what they're experiencing. As you're experiencing now, that God is saying, give me your heart. Invest yourself in this gospel. Invest yourself in your freedom. Get invested in your own liberty. You're going to see, God is going to say also, there's a sea you have to cross. And as they came over, so will you. So will we. We'll come over together. Listen, God bless you. And I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your Thursday evening. Appreciate your time.